This is Bangladesh. First, we need to find the village of Nimtola. Here it is. The village is surrounded by farmland, and once a year, those fields start killing farmers and local people. There's a bridge here that shows what the fields look like under normal conditions. You can even spot people trying to bring in the harvest before disaster strikes. The best way to see that disaster is to change the map imagery dates from April 9th, 2020 to October 27th, 2020. The difference is clear. The fields are completely flooded, and the water that arrives here is far from harmless. It brings in extremely dangerous, nearly invisible animals. This happens every year across Bangladesh during the rainy season. Floodwater covers the fields, drives venomous snakes out of their hiding places, and pushes them closer to people. Even so, farmers still have to work in the flooded fields, and together they suffer around 700,000 snake bites a year. Thousands die, and there's little they can do about it. But in Brazil, there's the Amazon River, right here, and it's home to creatures that might, at least in theory, protect farmers from snakes: piranhas. If thousands of piranhas were released into the flooded fields during the monsoon season, they'd be fine. They'd probably have enough water to survive, and the conditions would be fairly similar to their natural habitat. They would not be expected to attack people, but snakes would be a very different story. To feed themselves, the piranhas would go after any animals stranded in the flooded fields. And Bangladesh could supposedly make this happen, because collecting piranhas in the Amazon wouldn't be difficult. So why do thousands of people in Bangladesh die from snake bites every year? The problem is that people and snakes in Bangladesh share the same space every single day. That's why the country sees about 700,000 bites and roughly 6,000 deaths annually. It's a very serious problem. What's more, most bites happen in rural areas rather than in cities, even though cities have larger populations. At first glance, you might expect the biggest population centers to account for a much higher share of victims if the danger were spread evenly, but the real reason is actually obvious. In rural areas, people are constantly surrounded by the same environment as snakes. They work the land, walk barefoot, and even sleep in houses that are barely separated from the natural world. The boundary between home and the wild is so thin that encounters happen all the time. Hey, what are you doing in my house? What are you doing in my house? As a result, about 95% of all snake bites happen in rural areas where people are literally sharing every square foot with snakes. But the most interesting part is something else. Many bites do not happen on dry land where snakes are easier to spot. You'd think that if the danger were only tied to working on the ground, the risk would go down in open areas where you can clearly see what's moving underfoot. But the real issue's different. A large share of these encounters happen in the water. And that's where people lose control of the situation completely. In murky water, it's impossible to see the danger ahead of time, and every movement becomes slower and less precise. As a result, about 27% of bites happen directly in the water, while people are swimming, fishing, or working in flooded areas. Ow! Something bit me! Ugh, I bit something. So the reason's not just human behavior, but also the environment itself. Land that regularly goes underwater is bad for snakes because they lose their usual hiding places. In other words, they're forced to keep moving. The problem is that during these periods, floodwater fills burrows, bushes, and natural shelters, leaving snakes with no safe places. But snakes don't drown, they move to wherever it's drier and warmer, closer to people. As a result, during floods, snakes end up in villages, on roads, and in farmland in huge numbers, right next to humans. Rice fields are especially dangerous, even though at first glance they look like ordinary farmland. When crops are grown in standing water, people have to spend hours working in flooded conditions, and, as I said earlier, visibility there's terrible. On top of that, these fields attract snakes because they offer water, cover, and small prey. Some snakes flee the water and end up near people. Others move toward the water and still end up near people. It's a game people cannot win. A person steps into a rice field thinking of it as a workplace, but for the snake, it's already part of its home, and it may defend that home fiercely. And snakes can move pretty fast in the water, quickly enough to bite, too. If swimming were some rare ability for them, things would be way easier. The problem is that most people think of snakes as strictly land animals, but that's not true at all. In reality, most species adapt to water with ease. They can cross flooded areas, hunt, and hide in bodies of water of all kinds and depths. So the danger's not limited to a few specifically aquatic species. Ordinary land snakes are good swimmers, which means flooded areas do not reduce the risk. They actually make it worse. Of course, different snake species affect the overall danger level in different ways, so it's important to understand which ones are actually responsible for most bites. We can't just blame every snake. There it is! It's the one who bit Steve! Get it, boys! It wasn't me! I'm just a grass snake! I don't even have fangs! If this were mainly about rare or relatively harmless species, the scale of the problem would be smaller. But the reality is that Bangladesh is home to several groups of venomous snakes that are found all over the country and naturally come into contact with people all the time. So it's not just one venomous troublemaker, it's a whole gang. The biggest threat comes from cobras, kraits, and vipers. These groups include some of the most venomous snakes in the region, and they're also responsible for most deaths. Still, the snake that plays the biggest role is not necessarily the most venomous one, but the one people run into the most. If you look only at venom potency, you might expect the deadliest species to top the list. But how often people encounter them matters more than how toxic they are. Let me explain. Some snakes are simply better adapted to living near humans and end up in human environments more often. In Bangladesh, that's exactly the case with the monocled cobra. It's widespread, actively moves through the same areas where people live and work, and naturally bites more often than the others. But let's get back to the water. It doesn't raise the risk on its own, but by changing how people move and react. When you can clearly see the space in front of you, you can spot a snake and simply walk around it. The problem is that in water, visibility almost drops to zero. Especially in murky, flooded areas where you can't see the bottom at all, people move slowly, can't react in time, and often don't even realize what they're stepping on. And they're stepping on a snake. They stay until the very last moment and, of course, interpret what's happening as a threat. As a result, people literally step on snakes, which leads to repeated bites. I think people are to blame. If they decided to grow legs, they should at least look where they're putting them. That's how all kinds of radical ideas start to appear. Like, for example, could the number of snakes be reduced? Not by catching them one by one, but by working through the ecosystem itself. If snakes have natural enemies, then, in theory, those predators could help keep snake numbers under control. The problem is that within this environment, there are not enough of those predators to meaningfully reduce the risk for people, so the next logical step is to bring in something from outside the ecosystem, a species that can hunt under the same conditions where snake bites happen most often. And believe it or not, the leading candidate is a fish, a piranha. Now that's a form of biological control I've never seen before. Of course, that immediately raises doubts. Would piranhas even see snakes as prey? If their diet were limited to fish and carrion, snakes wouldn't really belong on the menu. Well, not while they're still alive, obviously. But there's also good news. Piranhas are not especially picky. Their feeding habits depend on what food is available. They react to movement, size, and vulnerability rather than to the exact species. That suggests their range of possible prey is wider than most people assume. There's even a case described in the scientific literature where a partially digested aquatic snake was found in a piranha's stomach. So, under certain conditions, piranhas really can attack the target group. But why try to reduce risk everywhere if there's one specific zone where the danger's greatest? If most bites happen in a particular environment, then that's exactly where efforts should be concentrated. And when people try to solve the problem only in general, those solutions may never even reach the places where the risk is greatest. That is, flooded rice fields where people spend long hours working. Basically, if we're going to change anything, we have to start with those fields. Otherwise, none of this makes any sense. Okay, but could rice paddies really sustain piranhas? If they're just shallow puddles, the fish would simply die. The issue is that rice fields are not permanent bodies of water. Their condition depends entirely on the season and the water level. But what if we look at the rainy season? At that point, the fields basically turn into actual bodies of water. The water can stay there for weeks, and in some places even for months. In conditions like that, aquatic life can obviously survive just fine, which means that during the flood season, rice paddies can, in theory, support fish populations, including predatory fish. So if the water stays in the fields consistently, that creates a pretty normal, fully functional habitat. And if there's enough food available, predators behave in a predictable way. That is, they don't waste energy on risky attacks. The problem is that piranha behavior depends directly on how much food is available. If they have access to their usual prey, that's what they'll go after because it's the easiest and safest option. In the wild, piranhas mostly feed on small fish, insects, and organic matter, which is not going anywhere, so they don't even have to chase it down. Basically, if there's plenty of food, piranhas won't even bother with snakes. Okay. Or a sandwich. Or whatever this is. Hard pass. But that raises another important question. Would piranhas be dangerous to humans in conditions like these? I grew up hearing stories about how piranhas are bloodthirsty monsters that can bite your arm off if you put it in the water. In reality, piranhas attack large, actively moving animals very rarely. The fear surrounding them is often overblown, and the myths about them don't really reflect how they behave in real life. Most of the time, piranhas avoid large animals unless they're hungry or stressed. If piranhas don't have enough normal food, a human doesn't even register as prey, not even in theory. In practice, attacks are extremely rare, and piranhas usually don't pose any serious threat. But what about snakes as prey? If the target's smaller, already in the water, and can't get away quickly, it becomes far more vulnerable to a predator. On top of that, snakes often do poorly in flooded areas. They have to keep moving, search for shelter, and burn energy. Their maneuverability in water is limited, especially if they've been stuck there for a long time and are already tired. Well, for piranhas, that's basically an open invitation. They react to movement, vibrations, and signs of weakness, so a snake in that state would immediately look like an easy target. The whole plan would only work under one condition. There has to be very little food in the water. If there's already plenty of easy prey around, predators won't waste energy going after harder targets. Piranhas have no idea what altruism is. They act purely in their own self-interest. Hey, for the record, I donate to charities. In rice fields, the food supply is limited. There's less fish and fewer stable food sources. In conditions like that, competition gets tougher and the range of options narrows. When there isn't enough accessible food, piranhas become less picky and may start attacking more unusual targets, including snakes. Bingo! But it's not just about rice fields. The country has far more water than that. If you look at the rivers and seasonal flooding, piranhas would have enormous potential there too. The real issue is this. To establish themselves, they wouldn't just need temporary water, they'd need a network of connected bodies of water that comes back year after year. And Bangladesh already has exactly that. There are plenty of rivers there that flood on a regular basis, which means that under the right conditions, piranhas could theoretically settle not only in the paddies, but pretty much anywhere the water is relatively stable. But once again, the real question comes down to resources. Is there enough food in all these waters to make piranhas behave the way people want them to? Because the whole point is for them to eat snakes, not go for something easier. The problem is that their diet's already well established, and snakes are nowhere near the top of the menu. I'll have carry-on for the appetizer and a couple of insects for the main course. May I recommend the snake? It's our new dessert. Nope. So basically, if piranhas already have enough to eat, they won't go hunting snakes. And that means putting predatory fish in the water would do absolutely nothing to reduce snake numbers. But everything changes fast when food becomes scarce. If local fish aren't adapted to a predator like the piranha, they won't be able to defend themselves. The ecosystem won't have time to adjust to this new player, and as a result, the overall food supply will drop sharply. And once their main prey disappears, piranhas have to adapt. They become less picky and more aggressive. They stop reacting so selectively and start going after almost anything that's roughly the right size. And suddenly, snakes don't look like such a bad option. A scenario like that directly increases the odds of encounters with other animals in the water. If snakes often end up in the same places where piranhas hunt, sooner or later they're going to cross paths. Aquatic and semi-aquatic snakes, especially if they're weakened after moving around or stressed out, become vulnerable. Their movements in the water can attract attention and trigger an attack, and piranhas really don't need much encouragement. So in the end, it's simple. The less food there is, the higher the chance that piranhas will start attacking snakes as available prey. But what about people? It seems like if a predator's starving and getting more aggressive, the risk should go up for everyone. Logically, you might expect piranhas to attack anything within reach. The good news is that reality is more complicated than that. Even under stress, piranhas don't see humans as primary prey. We're too large, we move too actively, and we don't give off the usual signals they rely on when choosing a target. Yes, attacks on humans have been recorded, but those were rare, extreme situations, usually when there were too many fish, too little water, and intense competition for food. At that point, whatever gets bitten counts as prey. But overall, people probably don't need to worry too much. Now the key question is which species, if any, would even be suitable for dealing with snakes? That was the whole point from the start. After all, not all piranhas are the same, and they don't all behave the same way either. Choose the wrong species and the consequences could be completely unpredictable. If you introduce something too aggressively or too poorly studied, you could seriously damage the entire ecosystem. So the real challenge is finding the right balance. The fish would need to be effective enough to make a difference while still being predictable enough to control. Though, of course, the idea of controlling a fish is a little questionable. The species people usually consider first is the red-bellied piranha, Pygocentris natereri. This species has been studied more than the others, and there's more data on it, which means there's less chance that things will go off the rails. But then there's the next problem. You still have to get the fish from somewhere. If getting piranhas is too difficult or too expensive, the whole project falls apart, no matter how good it looks on paper. The issue is that the species doesn't live here at all. The red-bellied piranha is native to the Amazon basin in South America, which immediately makes the whole plan much more complicated. And just to remind you, we're in Bangladesh, on the other side of the world. Bringing the fish in would require international import permits, endless approvals, and biosecurity checks. That means more risks, more money, and a lot more logistical headaches. And then there's the process itself, transporting the fish and releasing them into a new environment. If anything goes wrong, the piranhas may not even survive the journey or the adaptation period. The problem is that they are fairly sensitive fish. Piranhas need stable water temperature, proper oxygen levels, and as little stress as possible. During a long shipment, even a small disruption could kill them. And even if they do arrive alive, you can't just dump them straight into the water. They need to be acclimated gradually so they can adjust to the new temperature and water chemistry. Skip those steps and all you get is rice fields full of dead piranhas. But the biggest question is whether any of this would actually work in real life. If a predator's not specifically targeting the prey population you want to reduce, it's not going to help much. And piranhas don't target only snakes. Even if they share the same habitat, piranhas will still go after whatever's easier and more familiar, which means their effect on snakes would be completely hit or miss. Maybe it works in one place, maybe it doesn't in another. In the end, an idea like this offers neither guarantees nor consistent results. There are just too many unknowns, and it's almost impossible to predict how it would turn out. But you can't judge an idea by the concept alone. You also have to look at the consequences. If an intervention disrupts the natural balance, the outcome can end up being worse than the original problem, and introducing a new predator almost never happens without side effects. Native species are not prepared for it, food chains start shifting, and then the whole system can begin to unravel. And at that point, you can forget about keeping it under control. The track record of experiments like this speaks for itself. They often end with local species disappearing and other signs of a localized ecological disaster. The safest and most predictable solutions usually have nothing to do with altering nature in the first place. They tend to focus instead on changing how people behave. If the problem is that people keep running into snakes, that can be addressed without drastic measures. A lot of the risk comes from working conditions and a lack of information, and even basic steps can already make a difference. Protective clothing, lighting at night, and minor adjustments to fieldwork routines. It's also important that people know how to avoid danger and what to do if a bite does happen. There is, however, another serious issue. Antivenom is in short supply, and instead of going to doctors, people often turn to traditional healers. So in the end, the focus shifts away from finding some kind of predator and toward the system that allows the problem to happen in the first place. Improve the basic conditions and things get a whole lot better. The real issue is that help after a bite often arrives too late or doesn't arrive at all. But if there are roads, transportation, electricity, and proper access to medical care, the chances of survival go up dramatically right away. Add public education on top of that, and the risk drops at every stage. In the end, it all comes down to a simple question. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? If the potential damage could outweigh the effect, then the idea simply doesn't make sense. Piranhas, of course, offer no guarantee that snake numbers would actually go down. What they do bring is plenty of risk, both for the ecosystem and from a practical standpoint. Even if such a plan could be put into action, the consequences would be hard to control, and the result might be barely noticeable. Or there may be no result at all. So in the end, the idea remains more of a theory than something that could actually be used in real life. The more reliable solutions are medicine, public awareness, and better living and working conditions, though, of course, those sound a lot less exciting. You owe me a like. See you later.